There is a place in the world where the future of global energy is being decided, not in boardrooms, not in parliaments, not even in war rooms, but in the desert, in Niger, a country most people cannot locate on a map, yet one that quietly powers entire nations, because beneath its soil lies uranium, the fuel of modern civilization, the material that keeps lights on, cities alive, and industries running. But here is the contradiction. For decades, Niger powered the world while remaining in darkness itself. Overnight, Niger went from an obscure landlocked desert country to an essential player courted by the world's superpowers. Suddenly, there were coups and sanctions. French troops given ultimatum to leave the country. American military bases under review. ECOWAS threatening intervention. Citizens waving Russian flags in the streets. Chinese companies and governments are offering infrastructure deals for access to mining rights and minerals, all of which have grabbed global headlines. Why did a country most people couldn't point to on a map suddenly become one of the most talked about geopolitical flashpoints in the world? Because Niger sits at the intersection of three forces shaping the 21st century: energy, military power, and sovereignty. And when those three collide in one place, the world pays attention. The old system is breaking, and the deals being signed today may reshape the balance of power for decades to come. This is not just a story about mining. This is a story about control, about leverage, about who will own the future of energy. Because Niger is one of the world's largest producers of uranium. And uranium is not just another mineral. Uranium is electricity. Uranium is nuclear deterrence. Uranium is leverage. Today we'll look at the secret resource war you've probably never heard of and explain why the world is fighting over Niger's uranium. Chapter 1. The French Cold Case. Now let's rewind. To understand what is happening today, you have to understand what came before. Because this story didn't start in 2023. It started over half a century ago when Niger gained independence from France. On paper, that moment marked sovereignty. But in practice, very little changed. Because while political control shifted, economic control remained. France did not need to rule Niger directly. It only needed to control what mattered most: resources, and uranium was at the center of that control. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, France secured access to Niger's uranium through long-term agreements. These agreements were managed through what is now known as Uranium. The structure was simple. France would invest in extraction, operate the mines, export the uranium, and in return, Niger would receive royalties. But the key question is not whether Niger was paid. The question is how much value was actually retained. Because in global commodity chains, the real money is not in extraction. It is in processing, refinement, technology, control of supply chains. And France controlled all of that. Niger exported raw uranium. France converted it into energy, into profit, into geopolitical leverage. This is how dependency works, not through force, but through structure. The town of Arlit became the center of this system, a mining hub in the Sahara, one of the largest uranium-producing zones in the world. For decades, it fed France's nuclear grid. France generates roughly 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. That nuclear fleet requires uranium fuel, a significant portion of which comes from Niger. And yet, conditions in Arlit told a different story. Limited infrastructure, environmental concerns, low local development, the wealth flowing out of the ground, did not translate into widespread prosperity because the system was not designed for that. It was designed for extraction. This contrast became symbolic. France lit up at night. Niger struggled with electricity access. Many Nigerians questioned how a country that exports so much strategic material could remain so poor. That imbalance fed resentment. And resentment in geopolitics is like pressure underground. It builds slowly. Then one day it cracks the surface. Now add the second layer, military positioning. The Sahel region, stretching across West Africa, has become a hotspot for insurgent groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Western governments, especially France and the United States, established military bases in Niger to combat these threats. The United States built a massive drone base in Agadas, reportedly costing over $100 million. France maintained troops in the region under Operation Barkhane. Niger became a key logistics hub for Western counterterrorism efforts. In simple terms, Niger became a forward operating platform. If West Africa was a chessboard, Niger was one of the squares that allowed outside powers to project influence across the Sahel. So Niger was important, but quietly important. By 2023, this model had reached its limit. Public frustration had grown. Political tensions had escalated. And then came the turning point. A military coup overthrew President Mohamed Bazoum. Coup announcements in Africa are not new. But this one hit differently. Why? Because it challenged two pillars at once: Western military presence and Western energy security. The junta that took power signaled hostility toward France. Protests erupted in Niamey. French flags were burned. Russian flags appeared in crowds, not necessarily because Russia had taken control, but because Russia represented an alternative. France announced troop withdrawals. The United States began reassessing its position. ECOWAS, the regional bloc, threatened military intervention but hesitated. Suddenly, Niger wasn't just about uranium. This was not just a political event, it was an economic rupture. Because the new leadership did something different. They questioned the system itself. They challenged the contracts. They rejected the old arrangements. And most importantly, they forced France out. French troops withdrew. Diplomatic ties fractured. And Orano's operations were suspended. For the first time in decades, France no longer controlled Niger's uranium. But here is the rule of geopolitics. A vacuum never stays empty. The moment France stepped back, others stepped forward. Not with speeches, not with promises, but with deals. And those deals would define the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Russian Exchange. When Russia entered Niger, it did not arrive as an investor. It arrived as a security provider. Because Niger was facing a real threat: insurgency, instability, regional conflict. And in moments like this, security becomes the most valuable currency. Russia understood that. So instead of offering development aid or economic partnerships, it offered something more immediate: protection. Reports began to emerge of Russian personnel arriving in Niamey, not under the banner of traditional diplomacy, but through structures linked to what was once known as Wagner and now reorganized under the Africa Corps. This was not accidental. This was strategic, because Russia's model in Africa has followed a clear pattern: security in exchange for resources. This is the core of the deal: not cash, not loans, but access, mining rights, strategic concessions. And in Niger, the focus quickly turned to one of the most important assets in the world: Uranium, one of the largest uranium deposits globally, still largely untapped. A prize. Whoever controls Uranium controls a significant piece of future uranium supply. And uranium is no longer just a resource. It is becoming a strategic weapon. Here is where the analysis deepens. Russia is not just thinking about Niger, it is thinking globally. Because uranium supply is concentrated, a handful of countries dominate production, and if supply becomes constrained, prices rise and dependence increases, leverage expands. Now consider this. Russia already has influence in uranium markets. Kazakhstan, the world's largest producer, has strong ties to Russia. If Russia extends that influence into Niger, it begins to shape global supply. Not fully control it, but influence it. And in geopolitics, influence is enough. Because if you can restrict access, you can shape outcomes. Especially in a world transitioning toward nuclear energy. This is not about Niger alone. This is about positioning. In a future where fossil fuels are declining, nuclear energy is expanding, energy security is critical, uranium becomes strategic, and controlling supply chains becomes power. So the question is not, why is Russia in Niger? The question is, what role does Niger play in Russia's global strategy? Chapter 3. China's Long Game. While Russia operates through security, China operates through infrastructure, quietly and patiently or strategically. At the center of China's presence is China National Nuclear Corporation. Unlike Russia, China does not lead with military force. It leads with financing, construction, long-term planning. Take the Azalik mine. China's involvement here is not just about extraction. It is about building systems, roads, transport corridors, energy infrastructure, logistics networks. Because China's strategy is not short-term access, it is long-term integration. China is not thinking in election cycles. It is thinking in decades. Its domestic nuclear expansion requires stable uranium supply, and securing that supply means owning relationships, building infrastructure, embedding itself into national economies. This is not extraction in the traditional sense. It is entanglement. And here is where the debate becomes complex. Some see China's model as practical, reliable, mutually beneficial. Others see it as long-term dependency, debt exposure, strategic leverage. Both perspectives exist, and both have evidence. Because China's approach is not simple, it is layered. Chapter 4, the collision course. Now bring it all together. France, Russia, China, three different models or three different strategies. One country, one resource. Map it out. French legacy assets, Russian security zones, Chinese infrastructure corridors. They intersect, they overlap, they compete. And that intersection is where tension lives. Because when multiple powers pursue strategic interests in the same space, conflict becomes possible. Not necessarily direct war, but political pressure, economic competition, strategic maneuvering. Niger becomes the ground where these interests collide, and the implications go far beyond Niger. If uranium supply is disrupted, Europe feels it. If supply is controlled, power shifts. If one bloc dominates access, it gains leverage over the energy transition. This is why this matters. This is not a local story. This is a global one. Final verdict, kingmaker or battleground? So where does this leave Niger? At a crossroads. For the first time in decades, it has leverage. Multiple powers competing, multiple deals on the table, multiple options. This creates opportunity, but also risk. Because history shows something clearly, competition does not guarantee benefit. It only creates possibility. The outcome depends on strategy, on negotiation, on control. The real question is, can Niger play these powers against each other, extract better terms, retain more value, build internal capacity, or will it become a proxy battlefield, a resource hub controlled externally, a repeating cycle of dependency,